Okay, so we're going to get started with exercise 129. This is the last official lecture of the class, so nice job making it this far. Remember, everything's due next Monday the 9th. You guys will come in like normal. I think it's final schedule, though, so we only go until 10, because I think you might... No, it's not anymore. It's just regular, isn't it? Yep. Sorry. Scratch that. That was 2 years ago when it was set up like that. So it's just like normal. Normal class day, normal timing, nothing different. You guys will come in. I'll have a survey for you guys to fill out. It's an online survey, so you can click on the link on the website, or you can type in the really weird address and get to the survey. You'll tell me what you liked about the class, what you didn't like about the class. Please be honest. It's really informative to have you guys give me that feedback. Those of you that have been in class with me before know that I ask this at the end of the semester. And it really kind of helps tweak what assignments are good, what assignments are bad. If you can come up with something other than Charlie Harper, I'd be so happy, because I'm really tired of Charlie Harper. I've asked that every year, and nobody's come up with anything better yet. So fingers crossed that one of you will come up with a better idea. So you guys will go through that. I'll bring donuts. I ordered the donuts today, so there will be lots of donuts for everybody. So it's kind of like your reward for the end of the semester. You get to have that. You'll turn in your portfolio. I'll have you put them on the back table, kind of where those other portfolios are. Those I'll collect and get rid of those today. And you'll put your portfolios there. A lot of times people like to sit and look through other people's portfolios, so you spend a little bit of time doing that. You're not required to stay for the whole class. I would appreciate it if you got here in the beginning of class rather than at the end of class, though, because then I can talk to everybody. Everybody can do the survey, and then you guys can go study or do whatever you need to do going forward. Remember that it is mandatory that you come and check in on Wednesday, because we have to, quote, hold class as official. It's the way it works. That's how they set it up. So we don't have finals week anymore, so you guys have to do that on Wednesday. So there's nothing you need to do for Wednesday other than come here, show up. I'll have a little sign-up sheet. You put your name on it, and then go study and get ready for your other tests. So there's nothing specific for this class, but you do have to come, and you'll get credit for coming and signing up on that sheet. Does that kind of make sense? Nice and clear for everybody? In terms of where we're going, don't forget that assignment 106 is due and the portfolio is due. You should have assignment 106 pretty well wrapped up by the end of today, because we basically did it in class. So it shouldn't be too much harder, other than you have to make your formal post. Don't rely on your exercises as your post. Make a formal post that has your best 3 of 4. Isn't it best 3 of 4? I think it's best 3 of 4 of these drawings. So today we're going to do the architectural perspective. My internet has been out all morning, so I keep hoping that it'll come back. Ah, look at that. It came back right before. So when we start with an architectural perspective, generally speaking, we would have visited the site. So you'd have site photos, so you could take your actual photo of the site and collage your building onto the site, which is always the best strategy. We didn't get to visit Yosemite, so we don't have a photograph that you took of the site to work with, so you're going to work with a generic picture of Yosemite. When you go and search for your pictures, the picture you pick is really important. So if I did an image search, I like the search term Yosemite Meadow. Somehow that gets good results out of it. Remember that when you're looking for it, we need to make sure that you have non-commercial reuse with modification as your license type. And then under size, make sure it's at least large. And then as you're looking at it, take a look over what the size is as you pick it. So like something like this would be a good one because of the size of the file. Something like this would not be so good because the size of the file isn't as good. When we're looking through the pictures, we need to spend a fair amount of time actually thinking about how would our building sit on the site. What would it look like? It's not like the elevation view where we're cutting off pretty much the bottom half of the site. You have to think about what would it look like. So for example, let's say I pick this image right here, and I were thinking about, yeah, it's a beautiful image, that's great, but what would my building look like? I have this deer that would have to be cut out. It would be in the foreground. Where would I put my building? Would I put it right here on the side? Would that path lead to the building? Would the building go here? It's kind of on a little bit of a slope. So there's some challenge to figuring out where would this really belong. Would it be the forefront? If I put the building right here, would my building essentially block the waterfall in the background? Is that something I want to have happen? Is that something I don't want to have happen? So you really kind of have to think a lot about how something would work out. This one is actually one that I've never done before, and because of the deer and whatever, it's kind of interesting, so I might do it. I'm going to go ahead and download the original file. It's a nice large file, which is good. Let me save this image onto my flash drive. The other thing, while I'm saving this, I want to remind you that I did do current grade sheets, so I have those to pass out. Don't let me forget to pass them out. That gives you a sense for where you are, what I have checked off, etc. It does not include last class's exercise. So I didn't include 128 on purpose because as I was doing the grades, not all of you had finished it yet, so I will go back and do 128 and 129. The grade sheet does also go up to exercise, I think, 132 or something. We don't have that many days in the semester, so those last ones just don't count. And if you look at the percentages, you can already kind of tell that they don't count. So in Photoshop, I went ahead and I opened some of the other images that I had from previous semesters because, again, my internet wasn't working particularly well. So I will open the one that I was just looking at here, and I will compare it to some of the other images that I've done in the past. So something like this is pretty easy. It's a nice short grass in the foreground. You can see where the building would sit. It would sit kind of prominently. That's a pretty easy one. If we looked at this one, I've done this one before in the past. This one's kind of fun because of the path. You could actually lead with this little boardwalk to wherever the building is, which makes it kind of a fun one. That would give you a path to the building, which would be nice. This one here is a little bit challenging because of this tree, and you have to decide, is your building going to tuck behind the tree? Is it going to be off to the tree? The other thing is this was shot with a bit of a fisheye, so all of these trees are kind of pointing toward the sky. You either need to correct the perspective of the image using the Skew tool. So it would be, let me right-click, Layer from Background. And we go in here to the Skew tool, Transform, and then Skew, so that we can straighten up those trees on either side. This probably needs to get a little bit taller, too. But you guys get the idea here. You'd have to fix, essentially, the photograph, or you'd have to really tweak the SketchUp file to get the same kind of perspective so they would look correct together. So that one's a particularly challenging one. This one's not too bad, except the grass is a little bit big in the foreground. So your building would end up being a little bit smaller toward the background for it to fit in right. And then this was that file that I was working with before. So on any one of these, the biggest challenge is to figure out how the building's going to sit on the site and then make the SketchUp file look correct for this particular perspective. So I'll do this a couple times with a couple different images just so you can kind of see how it works. In this scenario, we want to find the image first, or take the image if we went to the site, and then go to our SketchUp file. Let me switch into one of the perspective modes here. All right, so I'm in perspective mode. I'm going to go into camera, make sure that I'm set for perspective. That's good. And I need to think about what is this going to look like in relation to the image that I have. So you end up flipping kind of back and forth. So there's my image, there's my SketchUp, and I'm going to go back and forth as I kind of work through what they would look like. Now the problem with SketchUp is frequently people take a perspective that's too high. They look at the building like this, and when they go to put it in to their scene, it doesn't match up. The eye line doesn't match up. So it's really important to get yourself down into the correct eye line such that the horizon line is in the right spot. SketchUp has a built-in tool that can kind of help you with that. It's available in the large tool set. So if I went to my View menu, and I went to Toolbars, and I checked the large tool set option, down here, they have a position camera tool. It's a little person with an X below it. And what that position camera tool does is if you click on it, it allows you to say, if I was standing here looking at the building, what would it look like? And it kind of forces you down to an eye level perspective, which is a really nice way of looking at it. Right after you use that position camera tool, you get this little eye tool, which is the look around tool. And that can help you kind of orient your building to the site, etc. So as I'm looking at this here, and I go to look at my building, okay, I'm a little bit further away if I wanted it to be parallel kind of in there. So I'd have to come back, maybe zoom out a little bit, zoom over a little bit, maybe. There you go. So you kind of have to keep working at it a bit to get where that feels about right. So somewhere right about in there, and you can kind of flip back and forth. So that feels about right. It feels like it would sit into the scene about right. My eye level feels about right. Oops, sorry, wrong one. It needs to be down just a little bit more. Maybe about there. So I tend to just flip back and forth like this until I feel like, okay, that feels like it would sit in about the right perspective. At that point, I'm going to take the scene here, and I'm going to save the scene. I'm going to rename this particular scene to be perspective 2. That way I can come back to it. I would do the same thing for one of the other views. Of course, you only have to do this once. But let's say I was working with this particular image, and I wanted to align it to the path. That perspective is going to be different. So in this case, it might even help to get yourself out a little bit. Use that position camera tool again. Position the camera, say right about there. Use the look around. Something like that. Nope, I'm too far over. So we'll orbit the model a bit. Maybe like that. I'm thinking about where that path is and how that's going to line up with this path here. So I'm constantly going back and forth trying to sort that out. You know, it looks like maybe this needs to go down just a bit. Go back to that look around tool. Sync that just a little bit. And so maybe it's about there that it needs to be. So at this point, I'll go ahead and save this scene again. And we'll call this perspective 3. And so I'll go ahead and I'll export the lines and I'll see what they look like in the scene to check if the perspective lines up correctly. So this first one, I would go to File and then Export 2D Graphic. Let me get to my folder for today. I'll call it perspective 03 lines. Under my options, I'm going to change my size. We'll go up to 5,000. Oops. Uncheck the use view size. There we go. And I'll go ahead and say OK. And then export. I'll then jump back over into Photoshop. Here's my image. I'll go to File and then Place Embedded. I'll take that perspective. I'll place it in the scene here. You may just temporarily make it transparent, so I might adjust this opacity down so I can kind of see through, see my building. The other option would be to change the blending mode so that we see it there. This is a little bit harder to see, so I'm going to use the normal with some opacity because I think you guys will have an easier time on the screen kind of seeing it. And then it's a matter of positioning the building and saying, okay, there it is lining up on the stairs. It looks like the stairs kind of come through. All right, that feels like it's about right in the position. The size is about right. Let me switch this. We'll commit to it. And then I'm going to take this layer here. And then we go to multiply. A little bit hard to see until I cut it out. Let me go back to my regular normal so you can see it. So I can start working with this. I can start cutting it out. I need to obviously do the mask, etc. And I'll come back. But this perspective seems appropriate for the scene. It seems to fit. Now on this other one that I was working with, we'll check and see how that one plays out. And that's why I have these scenes saved, so it's easy to jump between the two scenes. as I kind of decide which one looks right. So on this one, I'll go ahead and go to File and Export 2D Graphic. This was perspective 2 lines, and I already have it set at 5,000, so we'll go ahead and export it. I'll jump back into Photoshop here. I'll go to File and then Place, Embedded. Perspective 2. Let me adjust that opacity here. And we'll pull this one down. And it would probably work, but I don't think it's as good. And I don't think it's lined up. I think the building has to twist just a little bit more. It might also have to be a little bit bigger. Oops. I always forget and hold down Shift here. Let's make that a little bit bigger. Tuck that in. I think because of the hillside, this one gets a little tricky. It looks a little too high here, and it looks a little too big there. So it's not quite the right perspective, but this is, again, part of the challenge. That's why I wanted you to see me have to work through this to decide which one's right. I'm going to stick with this one because it lined up pretty well, as opposed to this one because it just didn't quite line up as well as I wanted it to. So now here's the trick. On this one here, you already saw that I brought this in. Lining this up with the other exports is going to be a bit challenging. So I'm actually going to go back to opening the lines version, and then I'll bring in the background the way we've done it with the other ones. So let me go back to my SketchUp. I'm going to make all my exports. I'll go to perspective 3 because that's the one that I'm going to end up working with. I'll go to File. Let's see here. We need to turn on. We'll take a look at the X-ray view and see if that is good. Let me go to Edit. Face settings, we'll go to X-ray. Yeah, it might be okay. I'll export it anyway. I'll go to File, Export 2D Graphic. Wait, this was perspective 3, and this was X-ray. And so we'll export that. I'll turn off the X-ray. Now I'm going to turn on the shadows. So I'll go to View, and then check the box for shadows here. I may adjust the shadows, time of day and time of year here. So let's see, here's shadows, time of day, time of year. So the temptation is always make this look the best that you can, but in reality, we need to go back to our scene here and take a look at the shadows. Where are the shadows? This is a pretty high noon setup, so the shadows would be pretty vertical. It also appears, yeah, we can look right there. There's a shadow on that side. So there'd be not too much in the world of shadows for us to see in here. So we're actually seeing a lot more shadows than we really need to see. Let's see if I can make that adjust a little bit. It's going to be about that angle. And we'll go back a little bit. All right, I'm just kind of sorting through. We might be getting a little bit too much shadow in here, but it'll probably work. The alternative would be to change the orientation of the building and rotate the building around, but I don't want to go through with that right now. So I'll go ahead and I'll export the shadows, but before I do that, I want to make sure on my styles here, I'm going to go to the edge settings and I'm going to turn off edges, so all I get are just the shadows. So with just the shadows selected, I'll go to File and then Export 2D Graphic. And let's see here, this is going to be the shadows. And we'll export that. We could turn back on our edges. I'm going to turn off the shadows, so I'll go to View and then uncheck Shadows. But then I'm going to go into my styles, and I'll select the sketchy edge styles. And I'll use the airbrush with endpoints. I need to turn off my section cuts, my section planes, my section fill, and my guides, so that I have just the airbrush on. I'll go to File and then Export 2D Graphic. And we'll call this one Airbrush. And the last one that I did was the pen. Let's see if I can find it here. There's the pen gray. Actually, I had good luck last class with the pen black. So where's the pen black? There's pen black, a little bit darker. I'm going to go to View and then uncheck Section Cuts, Section Fill, Guides. There it is. I'll go to File and then Export 2D Graphic. And this one is going to be the lines. And then I'll export. Oops, sorry. No, this is going to be the pen. Apparently I'm still asleep too. And then export. Excellent. So I've done those exports. I'm going to jump back over into Photoshop. And so remember, I'm not going to place them all into here because lining them all up is going to be challenging. Instead, I'm going to open the first one, which would be the lines version. And I'll bring them all in here first. So I'll go to File, Place Embedded, and we'll bring each subsequent one in. So the next one was the X-ray. We'll commit, File, Place Embedded. Next one was the shadows. Place, commit, File, Place Embedded. Let's see, next one was the airbrush. Commit, File, Place Embedded. And the last one was the pen. Perfect. So I have all of those in. I'm going to change the blending modes on all of these. So I'll hold down Shift, select them all, change the blending modes to multiply. Now we're seeing through and we're seeing the building as a whole with the shadows, etc. So I have that in place. Now I need to bring in that image. I'm probably going to need a larger canvas size, but we'll get to that in just a second. I'm going to go ahead and go to File and then Place Embedded. And this is going to be the background image. So that was in one of my previous folders here. Let's see, it was in last fall. Yep, there it is. We'll place this. Now this time I'm going to make this image large enough. So I'm kind of doing this in the reverse order. So I'm going to keep making this image bigger, and I might need to switch this into multiply mode or even just change the opacity temporarily so we can kind of see it. I have to make sure that my path is going to line up with my building, so it's something about like that. Maybe this is a little bit larger here. All right, that seems pretty good. Call it right about there. I'll go ahead and commit to it. Notice that I lost a lot of the image. So this is where I can go to Image and then Canvas Size. I'm going to peg this corner this time as my anchor because I don't need to get bigger there. And I'm going to make my height bigger and my width bigger so that I make sure I get the whole image. I might need to make my width even a little bit bigger. So let me go back to Image and then Canvas Size. We'll put the anchor on the side here. We'll make my width 60. Make sure I get everything. Now I can come back with the crop tool and get exactly the size of that background image. So there, and then I can commit to it. I'm going to go ahead and turn the opacity up on that background, and now it's time to cut out the background for the building itself. So I'll turn off the background so we can see this. I'm going to turn off the shadows here, and I'm going to make sure that my regular lines are selected. I'll right click and say Layer from Background. We can call this one Lines. And really I should rename these. Let's call this X-ray. Sometimes it helps to rename the layers. Okay, so I'm going to make sure Lines is selected here. I'm going to use my Magic Wand tool, which is available underneath the Quick Selection tool. I'm going to select the background, That's pretty easy. But then I also have to pay attention to any place where I can actually see through the whole thing. So if I look in here, there's a tiny little sliver right there that I would be able to see through to my background. So I'm going to hold down Shift to make sure both are selected. Then I'll come up to the background, make it active, and click on the Add Layer Mask button right here. And we'll now cut it out for the building itself. So this is the first time, if I press Control-0, where we can really evaluate, does this building fit in the scene? Does it feel like it belongs in the scene? And I would argue that, yeah, the perspective seems about right, the eye level seems about right, so I'm willing to kind of keep pursuing this as a strategy. So it's always important to do that kind of initial test. Does it feel right? So at this point, we have to think about making this feel like it's not sitting on top of the picture, but rather sitting in the picture. And we've already done a little bit with the path, because the path leads to the stairs, so it feels like it sits in the picture. But in the front here, we haven't dealt with how the grass overlaps the scene. So right now, it's just a nice, stark, chopped line. So we want to make an adjustment there. And I'm going to do that by copying a piece of the background to work with. So we did this, if you remember way back when, it was like exercise probably 109, 108, something like that. We took from the background, make sure I'm on the background here, we took and copied a piece of that background. There it is. I'll go to Edit and then Copy, and then I'll go to Edit and then Paste. And it gives me just a piece of the background. If I were to turn everything else off, we'd see that there's just that piece of the background. I'm going to cut out that background piece. Let me keep that one off for a second. For the part of the building that I need. So let me use my magic wand tool. I'll select the outside. Oops, on the lines there. I'll select the outside of my building. There it is. Then I'll go to Select, Inverse. So I've selected the inside of the building. I'll go to this piece, and I'll press the Delete key to cut that out. So what I'm left with here, if I turn off my lines for a second, is essentially a cutout piece of grass for where the edge of my building is. That's what I'm looking for. We can now use the clone stamp to make that edge blend in a bit. So I'll use the clone stamp tool. Let's hope today it works for me. I'm going to load in the legacy brushes. So I'll click on the little gear icon in brushes. I'm going to click on legacy brushes. Under legacy brushes, it's going to be under the default, about halfway down is going to be the grass brush. There it is. I'm going to select that grass brush. With the clone stamp selected, I'm going to hold down the Alt key to choose where I'm copying from, and then I'm going to copy the grass over. Now my brush might need to adjust the size just a little bit, so it's probably about like that or so. If you're struggling to see it, you could turn back on the lines and you can start to see that that grass is coming around and covering up. Our goal here is to completely cover that black line that is the bottom of our drawing. So whenever I go back in perspective, depending on how far back I need to go, I may need to adjust the brush size. So I'll start out kind of taller with my grass, and then as I get further back, I might have to go down in size to mimic the perspective a little bit. So I'll do that, and then I'm going to work my way along here. Might need to hold down Alt and copy from a different location. All right. That's going to need to be cut off because I can't have the grass extending into that line. So I might have to use the magic wand, use my lines layer, make that selection again, come back to my grass, and then delete that so it's a sharp edge there. Then we'll come back, I'll deselect everything using the rectangular marquee, come back, and we'll do some more grass in the front here. Now that grass probably needs to be a little bit bigger because it's closer to us. So a little bit bigger. Then we'll go back to a little bit smaller as we turn around the corner here. So we'll do that. I'll hold down Alt to change and copy from this color grass, a little bit smaller on the brush side, and we'll cover that part up right there. And then you'll work your way across this section. I'm going to go a little bit faster here. It looks like I'm getting a little bit of clipping from the top of my grass. It's too straight, so we might need to go and make a few adjustments there. All right. Let me hold down Alt. I'm going to copy from, and we're going to kind of cover up that section there. I didn't like that darker grass, so we'll get rid of that. Continuing along, we can do this section. And for me, because the building is fairly parallel to my view, it's pretty easy. I don't have to change the size of the brush too much. Most of it is just fine. So let me kind of fill the rest of this in here. All right, so I filled that part in. Now if I zoom out, if I press Control-0 and I turn the background on, let me zoom in a little bit so you can see just the building here. The building now feels like it's in the site as opposed to sitting on top of the photo. We did the same thing with the feet of the people when we collaged in people, which we'll get to in a little bit. For me here, I have to think about how this path connects in just a little bit. If we look at the path closely, it looks like there's a little bit of a border on this side. So really, this should go up and over to accommodate that border. I can do that on the mask layer here. I'll use a little rectangular marquee tool, and we will, it's maybe about that tall there. I'm going to paint on this with white so that that becomes visible there. The goal would be, see how that kind of comes up. Looks like I missed a little bit right there. So we'll go back and we'll paint that in. So I'm just paying attention to how these things kind of would go together such that it feels like they're more integral. This is straight across, so there's not a whole lot I can do to change how those two come together. That seems like a reasonable connection point. All right, I think I'm okay with that. We'll zoom out. And so this by itself is starting to feel pretty good as being part of the scene. Now, if we want to think about the building materials, etc., we have to kind of sort through, do we shade the windows? Do we put materials on the building as a whole? What's our goal here? Do we want it to live just as a drawing? And there's certainly an argument for living just as a drawing. That could look just fine. We also can think about, do we want the background to become a black and white image, or do we want it to stay in color? So you've always got these options to kind of sort through what feels right, what looks right, etc. I'm going to go ahead and collage in the windows. I think that's a good strategy, and I'm going to leave the bulk of the building white. Remember that in a scene like this, we're not really trying to make our building photorealistic, such that, hey, this is exactly what it's going to look like. We're trying to show, hey, this is our architecture, this is how it fits in the building site. But by the way, we're designing the architecture, we're designing the building, so pay attention to that. Don't worry so much about the background. So sometimes it's a good strategy to leave some white as part of this. So if I'm going to collage in the windows, I need kind of this lightish colored sky to use for the windows. So I'll go find that. I'll go to File and then Place, Embedded. And I should have a fairly light sky somewhere. I have on my flash drive, in my resources folder, I have a bunch of skies that I can pick from. It's a fairly clear sky, so I'll look in the clear skies here. I'll use maybe something like this. We'll go ahead and place that in. Looks like the two colors of blue are slightly different, so I might need an adjustment layer on this. So I can go ahead and commit to this for right now. And then I might need to go into Layer, New Adjustment Layer. And let's do let's try a color balance. And let's see if I can get those two. That's, oh, let me do Control-Alt-G. Control-Alt-G to tie it just to the sky layer. And let's drop some of the blue back. No, it still has blue. I might need to do the hue and saturation instead. Let me turn that one off for a second. And go to Layer, New Adjustment Layer, Hue and Saturation. Control-Alt-G to tie it. And then let me drop the saturation down. There we go. That's a much closer match to the two skies. So I'm trying to work with the colors there to make them a little bit closer. I could even skew it a little bit more toward the blue. There we go. It's interesting. On my screen, they look very close. Up here, it's not quite as close. So it varies based on the projector a little bit. Okay, so I have that set up. I do, however, need to take this whole section, and I need to do a mask on it. So I'll come down to the lines layer. Let me turn off there. And I'm going to select, using the magic wand, all of the windows. Oops, let me make sure I'm on the lines layer. I'll hold down Shift, and I'll work through selecting all of the windows. If I had done the color, it would have been a little bit easier to make the selection. So in this case, I'm going to end up using the polygon Marquee. There's the polygonal lasso, because these selections are a little bit too challenging to do with the magic wand. So I'm going to hold down Shift to continue selecting, and I'm just going to draw boxes around these windows to make sure I get it all. There we go, I got all of that. And again, I'll hold down Shift. There we go. Let me press Control minus to zoom out just a little bit. And so there may be a few little artifacts in here. I can fix those after if I want. I'm going to go onto my sky layer here, and I'll click on the Add Layer Mask, which is going to cut out the windows for the sky as well. I may decide that I don't want those to be quite as opaque. I could adjust the transparency a little bit of those windows. I could also play around with the blending modes. So like a multiply blending mode, for example, might be a good strategy because it lets a little bit of the inside kind of filter through. You can see that if I zoom in a little bit more. Like that, versus a non-multiply is looking like that. So if I go to a multiply, there you go, I can see a little bit more through, but these are starting to feel a little bit like the glass of the window, and I've certainly identified what would be glass and what wouldn't be glass. So at this point, I could collage in some materials. I'm going to show you some materials just so you could see how you would go about doing it. In my case, I don't think I would actually do it because I think it detracts from the overall scene a little bit too much. But if I wanted to bring in materials, in a perspective view, we have to pay a little bit more attention to the perspective itself. So if I went to File and then Place Embedded, and I dropped in, let me get, I'm going to borrow a V-Ray concrete texture here. There we go. Let me zoom out just a little bit. And I'm going to adjust the size. And I want to get about 4.5, something like that. It's probably right about there. I'm lining this up on that edge, like that. I'll go ahead and commit to it. I want one more just in case, although that probably will be big enough. You want to collage in however much you think you're going to need. But then with this, I'm going to change the opacity a bit so that you can see it. But then I'm going to skew this so it matches up with the vanishing points. So I'll go ahead and go to my skew tool. I'll go to Edit, Transform, and then Skew. And I'm going to deliberately pull this down and back and up and back. And as I start to work with this, let me make this a little bit more opaque so you can see it better. There we go, something like that. You see, I'm trying to match up these lines with my building itself. So this ends up needing to come down a little bit and back a little bit. It comes over a little bit like that. Yep, that's pretty close. So once I have this set up in perspective, I can then commit to it. I can use my lines layer and my magic wand to select that edge. And then I can go back and on my concrete layer, click Add Layer Mask, and it's going to cut out the material such that it fits in perspective on that wall. You guys see how I did that? So it takes a lot of work to apply materials to the walls because I would need to do that material here, I would need to do that material here, and each time it's a different skew, it's a different perspective to get it to fit. So there's lots of individual little material applications. If I did it on this section right here, I would do the same thing. I'd go to File and then Place Embedded. And place that in. I again have to kind of think about the overall size. I can use my edge here as a bit of a cue because it's about the same size. It might be slightly smaller because it's slightly further away. Start to get that one committed. There we go. Then we'll go into my skew again. So I'll go to Transform and then Skew. I know I'm going to need to shorten that up a bit. And then this is going to have to go into perspective. Sometimes switching that so that it's in your opacity comes down will help you kind of line things up. So I want to make sure that there I am. It looks like I'm not quite at the correct perspective yet. That looks a little bit better. Judging the bottom is always a little bit harder. Looks like it's more like that. This needs to go up a little bit more like that. Okay, that feels pretty good there. I'll commit to it. And then same thing, using my lines layer, I'll use the magic wand to select that wall. I'll come back up to my texture, and then I'll click on Add Layer Mask, and that then cuts it out for that wall. Did you guys see how I went through that process? It takes a little bit of time to get it right and to get used to it, but that's how you essentially fake materials in perspective. So you take the flat material and you use Skew to get it to go into perspective, and that's how you would apply materials to your building. So in my case, I don't know that it's necessarily the most important thing to do, but I wanted to at least point it out so that you guys were aware that that's how you would go through applying that material. I have the option here on these to switch those materials into being multiply mode. So I could select both of those. I could turn those into multiply. Lets the lines show through a little bit more. So it's a matter of personal preference. So at this point, it would also be a good idea to throw in some people for scale. So I'd go to File and then Place, Embedded. And in this scenario, if you go back to that lecture that we did earlier in the semester, we're using the same strategy here where we're going and finding the people, and then we're going to bring them into the scene. So let's go into my resources. There's my people. Now in this example, I could use the color person, or I could use the silhouette, or I could use the black and white version. It depends on what you're looking for. I'm going to go ahead and go with the color version. I'll click Place. Now the sun is on this side, which is a bit of a problem, so I want to flip the sun to the other side. So I'm going to flip her So we'll go to transform, and we're going to flip vertical. Never mind. I always get those backwards. We're going to flip it horizontal. All right, now at least the shadow's on the correct side. Now remember what I said about people. It's important to make sure that we understand where their eye level should be. So there's a place at which eye level should be. It's probably right about there. If she was standing on the path right here, walking toward my building, that's about right for where eye level should be. If I want her further into the scene, I have to keep her eye level roughly the same and just push her further back into the scene. So I want to think carefully about where this person belongs and therefore how big she should be walking toward the building. So maybe it's about like that. So she looks just like the building. She looks like she's floating. So we have to give her some grounding. That's where the shadow comes in. I'll go to File and then Place Embedded. I have the silhouette for her right here. I need to make that silhouette a little bit smaller so it matches up. I also need to reflect that silhouette, so I'll go to Transform, and we're going to flip it horizontal. I did it correctly that time. That needs to get a little bit larger, right about like that. Then we're working in Skew mode again. Oh, it looks like I never actually turned on my shadows. Let me turn back on those shadows. So you can see a little bit. I might have to work with the building shadows so you can see it, but I'll work with the lady shadows here first. So I'm going to go into Skew. I'll go to Transform, and we will go to Skew. And her shadow, as I start to work, is going to go over this direction, and then down, and then down. And actually, I could have, before I even started doing this, I could have reflected it down because I need to get it down onto the ground there. It then needs to go over to this side, probably a little bit shorter, further to the side, further to the side. This needs to come back. All right, so again, I'm working through her shadow, getting the angle right. I could use some better guides. I'm kind of guessing at what the angle should be, but I want you guys to see this finished before we spend all day. I'm going to commit to it, then I'm going to take that shadow right here. I'm going to change the blending mode to multiply, so it's actually casting onto the ground. We're seeing through it. And then I have to think about how it hits the ground. So it's hitting reasonably there. So she feels like she's part of the scene. You can kind of see the shadows of the grass there. That helps you sort it out. But when I get to the edge of this little border, the shadow just can't go fully across it. So we need to actually cut it and pull it up. So I'll use my polygonal lasso tool. I'm going to cut right there. And I'll cut along this edge right there. Then I'll use the Move tool. This is a smart object, so it's not going to move right now unless I right-click and say Rasterize Layer. Then I can move this. I can cut it into and move it up so that it lines up with the upper edge of that little step there. And actually, as I'm looking at it, I need to make an adjustment. Let me go back for a second. I didn't quite grasp where the bottom was. That's the bottom of the shadow because of those little steps. There we go. Now I can use the Move tool. Nope. I need to be on the shadows. There we go. Now I can move it. Nope. I undid my rasterize. That was my problem. There we go. Now I can move it. Again, I want it to move straight up. So I'm coming straight up till I hit the top of that rail. Then I need to apply the shadow in between, and then obviously I need to fix the back edge. So first thing I'll do is rectangular marquee, and we're going to go down there, and this is going to come in kind of straight and then work its way up along the edge. About like that. Let me use my marquee. I'm going to subtract from the selection. No. There we go. Subtract from the selection just to get a little bit sharper edge right there. So I'm just going to cut that edge a little bit sharper. Okay, so now I have that little bit of selection. I need to match this color. So I can eyedropper that color. So let me turn off, it's sampling everything. So let me turn everything off. So I have just the shadow. I'll pick just the shadow to get the pure gray of the shadow. Then I can use my brush tool and I can paint in that part of the shadow there. I can deselect it so you can see it. Then let me turn back on all my layers so you can start to see how it's working its way up and also into that little hole. So I was very careful about how I set that up. The back edge of the shadow needs to be cut off. So I'll use the polygonal lasso again, and we'll cut this edge of the shadow off. So we'll go right there. And we can press delete to let that piece of the shadow go off. So remember, shadows are always the most important part because that's what makes us feel like we're seeing the scene correctly. So by just adjusting that shadow up and over the brick there, let me turn the rest of these back on, we're starting to make it feel like she's part of the scene. Now when we get over in here, we're in the grass part. So you notice I picked the most complicated shadow I could possibly pick to show you as a demonstration. So I'm showing you all the various pieces. Hopefully you won't have to do all of these. You'll just do one or the other, etc. So I dealt with that curb. Now it's time to deal with this last section of the shadow. I'm going to work with the shadow by itself. Turn everything off. There we go. I'm going to use my clone stamp, but before I need a region that I can copy and paste from. So we'll come down here. I'm going to fill that region with that gray color. So I'll use my brush. We'll make it a little bit bigger. We'll fill in with gray. I'll end up deleting that later on. And then I will use my clone stamp tool. I already have the grass brush selected. I'll hold down Alt to copy from this gray. We'll come up here. I might need to make my brush a little bit bigger so that I can put some grass on the back edge of that shadow. Perfect, right about like that. Then I need to do white on the front edge of the shadow. So I will take this big box here. I will flip my colors and I will use my brush tool and paint in white. Then I will come back to my clone stamp tool. I'll hold down Alt, copy from, and then I'll put in white on the front edge of that shadow. Right about like that. I'm going to need to clean up this back edge, so I'll use my polygonal lasso tool. It might be even easier to see it if we turn back on the background. Essentially, I need to get rid of that piece of the grass shadow right there. Let me make sure I'm on the shadow. We can delete that like that. So if I jump back here for a second, press Control minus, let me turn on the person herself. You can see that I've now made the shadow feel like it belongs in the scene. So it takes a little bit of work to kind of go through it, but I've made it so that it feels okay here. It jumps up, it jumps over, and now it's mixed in with the grass and feels like it's part of the grass. This edge should probably be a little bit blurry, so I might decide to come in here with the polygonal lasso, take this sharp part of it like that, go up to Filter, Blur, and do a Gaussian blur on it. It's probably only about 0.5 pixels or so, just blurring the edge just a little bit, maybe as much as 1. Just a whisker, so it's not quite so sharp. I made the selection before I did that so that the blur would not apply to the grass portion, but would only apply to the portion that's on the little boardwalk there. So it's just little subtle things that can kind of make it all come together. So I'll press Ctrl-0 to zoom out. We can turn everything back on. Don't want that color balance on. Like that. I never really dealt with the shadows on the building. I would have to deal with the shadows on the building in the same way that I just dealt with her shadow. The other thing is that the shadows on the building would end up needing to be higher in the layer stack. So I might end up coming all the way to the very top of everything so that the shadows were out on the very top. If I were going to keep those shadows, I would need to come in here and do the grass brush in white right along that outermost edge so that that would feel like it was belonging in the grass. I would come along here with that same white. When I got to this, it would be sharp across the path, but it would have a little jump around that curb. And then I would continue with the white along this edge. It would be gray along that edge, white along this edge, gray along that edge, and gray along the back. So it would take a little bit of integration. But I don't want to sit here and make you watch me do that because I just did it with the other shadow. You guys certainly get the idea. The last thing that you may or may not want to do, I did this briefly on the other one. I'm going to turn off the shadows for right now. I'm going to leave it like this, standing out, is you might want to add those birds. So I could load in that bird brush again. It was a simple Google search to find the bird brush. There it is. Let me extract it. Oops. I'll go back to Photoshop. To load it, I'd go to my presets. So I go to Edit and then Preset Manager. Sorry, it's File. Sometimes you just can't find stuff. It's Edit, Presets, Preset Manager. I was correct the first time. Under Brushes, I'd click Load. I'd go to my Downloads folder, which is where it was. I'd load those brushes. I'll click Done. Then I go to the Paintbrush tool. And under my brushes here, I'd come back up. We can close the legacy brushes. There's the birds. And I could pick, one of the groupings of brushes or groupings of birds. I think painting them in silhouette and black form is always a good strategy. And we get a new layer. Here we go. We decide what the right size is, and then we paint those birds in. Again, not giant fields and flocks of birds, just little subtle, couple birds here, couple birds there. And that's probably all you need. I don't even like this grouping that much. I think I might pick one of the other groupings. Let's try this one. Yeah, that one's a little more subtle. Maybe a little bit bigger. There we go. So something subtle to kind of enhance the composition. So this is what we're shooting for from the perspective standpoint. We're getting it integrated into the scene. In this case, it should be in perspective. We should see those vanishing point lines. We should be able to stick it into the scene, use the clone stamp to cover up the bottom edge with the grass brush so that it feels like it's integral to the scene, unless, of course, it's on some kind of a hard ground instead. Integrate people, shadows, all of that sort of work, and then you get something like this as your final product. Yeah? So if there's windows on both sides, you'd be seeing through into the background. So let's say that I had a window. I'm going to use just a regular selection here. Let's say that I had a window on this back wall. And for clarity purposes, I'm going to draw it here. I had kind of a tall, skinny window. So let's say that that was my window. That went all the way through to the background. On the background layer, right here, on the mask, I would want to make sure that that was selected and was showing. So for me, I need to modify it, so I'll make sure that it's in white on the mask layer. I'll use my paintbrush tool, not with the bird brush, but with a regular brush. And then I could paint that in such that I was seeing the background through the window. And then you may end up applying some kind of an effect to just this particular piece to indicate that it's a window. Likewise, this would help if I need polygonal lasso here. Holding down Shift. Like that. Again on the mask, this time I'm going to paint in black. So those go away. And then we'd be seeing through the front glass into the back glass. Does that kind of make sense? So it's all just in how the masking is laid out. And you can cut that window through. You'd see a little black line around it, so it'd be a little easier for you to select it. I had to draw it in because I didn't have a window on that back wall. All right, any other questions? No? If you finish with this early, work on your portfolios. Hint, hint. All right, I'll let you guys go.